Welcome to today's final session of the Innovative City Summit. To wrap, I'm pleased to introduce Stephen Pedigo, who will be making a presentation on how to build an innovative economy. We're looking forward to taking some time at the end of Stephen's presentation to open up and answer questions from all of you. So feel free, as Stephen's going through his presentation, to put those in the question bar, and I'll field some of those when we get to the end of the presentation. Stephen is a professor of practice at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, and the director of the LBJ Urban Lab. He's also Vice President of Economic Development here at Resonance, so I get to work with Stephen quite often. Can't think of a better speaker to kind of wrap this up and take all of the themes and ideas that we heard, starting with Bruce Katz, as we looked at what is the innovation economy and the purpose of innovation districts, and our conversation that we just had with Greg, Tim, and Emma, as they looked at it from a UK perspective. And I think Stephen will really tie this all together through this presentation, and we'll look forward to fielding your questions at the end. So welcome, Stephen. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Chris, thanks for having me. Good to be with everybody this morning. It is great to be with you all live from Austin. So let's get started. When the organizers were asking us to put this presentation together, there were lots of ways to think about what we wanted to address when looking at an innovation-based economy. And really for today's talk, I want to do several things. I think first and foremost is probably reiterate a lot of the points that a lot of the previous speakers have made, and that is to talk about the importance of innovation and why innovation matters, and particularly why it matters for us that think about economic development and creating opportunity, jobs, and wealth creation in communities. So we'll start there. And secondly, then speak a little bit about some of the challenges that come with building an innovation-based economy. As we know, innovative-based economies can create externalities and challenges. And that will lead us to this question of thinking through how to really approach building an innovative economy through a lens of inclusivity and equity, real to important principles as we think about development, particularly community development today in our communities. And then I'm going to do a little bit of narrowing in. I'm going to then sort of take those broad perspectives and those principles and really focus them in on innovation districts. It's a great tool. It's a policy mechanism. It's a built environment mechanism that many cities across the world, here in the U.S. and Europe and other places that are employing. So we'll talk a little bit about the principles of innovation zones, offer some thoughts on how communities should be approaching those, share with you a few case studies and examples, and then again close with this idea of thinking about how do we take innovation zones, not only build competitive and innovative and robust ecosystems, but also do it in a way that is inclusive in building a community from the ground up. So let's first start with this idea of just why innovation-based economy matters. There's a lot of research out there that talks about the importance of innovation and the importance of innovation as it relates to economic development and particularly wealth creation and job creation in communities. But one of the really quick study that was of recent that really jumps out to me that I just want to point to is the work of Enrico Marcetti, who talks a little bit about the importance of high-tech cluster innovations and why high-tech and cluster innovations really matter to this idea of driving innovation across the country. And so really, this is a great study that really has just a couple key takeaways that I want to share with you. First and foremost is that it is so important to understand that the U.S. economy really benefits from the idea of high-tech clustering of innovations and inventors and folks that are doing work on startups and technology-based firms. It's an important part, it's an important principle of our ecosystems and of our communities. That's first. Secondly, as we look at innovation across the country, one of the things that jumps out about this study is that as we look at innovation across the U.S. particularly, what we find is that innovation is actually is very much concentrated in a set of regions. And in fact, through the study and authors look to suggest that when you look at innovation, actually it's concentrated in about 10 city regions across the country, controlling about 60 to 70% of all inventions as it relates into science and software. And as you think about policy discussions, and there's a lot of policy discussions across the U.S. and North America and Europe about the idea, Should we continue to push innovation clustering, or should we think about this idea of building innovation districts and innovation zones in other communities? One of the things that Mercetti finds in his work is that, in fact, if there was not this high-tech clustering that happens in communities, then in fact the U.S. would actually maybe less inventive and less productive. And he sort of measures this through patents and finds that the U.S. would actually produce less patents per year. And so all that is to say is that as we think about innovation, innovation is extremely important. It's important to our competitiveness. It's important to the resiliency of our communities. And I think for us as city developers and city builders and folks who are thinking about the idea of wanting to create communities that are more inclusive, one of the things that we have to really grapple with is how do we measure the externalities of that and the challenges of that. To sort of build on that work, the work of Rich Florida and Ian Hathaway and Karen King from the University of Toronto, Ian from the Center for American Entrepreneurship, also a fellow at Brookings, has done some really great work that has looked at the rise of the startup city across the world. And much like Mercetti's work has found that, in fact, when we look at startup cities across the country and across the world, that this is very much a concentrating effect, that in fact 6 cities across the world control about half of all VC capital. If we explore that out even to a larger, broader set of cities, there's about 24 cities that are controlling VC capital. And what's interesting about some of the work that Karen King and Rich Florida have done is looking at venture capital data and understanding that when we start to look at VC capital across the world, what we find is actually a lot of that investment is actually happening. Most of that investment, 6 in 10 of that investments, are actually happening in urban zip codes. And so again, building on this concentration effect, but over the course of time, we are seeing this idea of the rise of the city expand beyond just this concentration of these firms. Looking at some of the best practices that we see in places like Boston and New York and San Francisco and Seattle, and seeing how that's expanding to what a lot of folks are referring to as the rise of the rest, and some great work out of the Brookings Institution from my friend Mark Murio and his colleague Yang Yu, that really looked at how in the pandemic years, particularly, we saw this distributing effect of technology into sort of a wider set of places. And so one of the things that I take out of this is that why clustering is super important to our ecosystems and to our competitiveness as a country, and particularly to the ethos of many cities. We're actually starting to see, as we look across the country and across the U.S., particularly North America, some distributing effects of that and creating some opportunities for both innovation creation, but also raising policy questions for what does that mean for our communities going forward. And that is important to say that, as an approach around urban development for several decades was really about creating, the most innovative and creative city that you could, right? It was the idea of going all in on innovation-based economies to create that opportunity around, commercialization and patents and attraction of venture capital. But some of the work that we know through lots of other scholars and work that we've done, both here at LBJ School, but also even some of our work at Resonance, is actually some of the most innovative and creative cities actually happen to be some of the most unequal and divided cities. So I raised that point for us to think about this, is that as we're wanting to think about building innovative-based economies, startup communities, building out those ecosystems that really combine different types of technologies and different types of interests of commercialization, we need to really imagine and really raise the awareness that can create greater divides. And so that requires us to think about the implications for that. And one of the things that is, as we think about an innovative city, it's not just enough today to build an innovative city and a creative city. We have to build an innovative and creative city that is more inclusive and more representative of all community residents than we've done in the past. And so to that end, that requires us to think through an approach to really this idea of inclusive innovation. And there's lots of work out there. And as I was preparing for this talk, going through lots of scholarship and other studies. But one of the reports that really jumped out to me as a really interesting framework for inclusive innovation was the work that was done by the UK Innovation Districts Group. And they were looking at the role of innovation districts to build inclusivity. But before they sort of thought about the innovation district piece of this, they really pulled out to think about this idea of how do we build inclusive innovation as it relates to our larger ecosystem and our larger focus on building broader inclusive economies. And they really outline sort of three principles by which we should think about this as we build out innovation-based strategies. First is being cognizant about what they refer to as the diffusion of benefits. Who benefits from an inclusive, an innovation-based economy, and how do we broaden that opportunity for folks to participate in that? So really thinking about the diffusion of benefits and the diffusion of those benefits among different types of stakeholders and different types of community representatives as they participate in our inclusive approach, as our innovative approach to development. Secondly, is being very cognizant from this onset about the design of strategy, and if we are wanting to build an inclusive approach to innovation practices, understanding that requires different strategies and different approaches to strategies, and being really aware of that from the onset of the work that we do together as it relates to strategic efforts around innovation-based economies. And then finally, being very clear about how we deliver on those activities and how we ensure that we're reaching the right number of stakeholders, the right types of stakeholders, and offering the right type of opportunity that's available. So as we think about an inclusive approach, really focusing on the diffusion of benefits, who participates, the design of strategy, and then finally the execution on how we actually deliver those activities. And so, as we think about innovation-based economies, there's lots of approaches to think about this. And one of the reasons that I'm going to center in on this idea of innovation-based innovation districts is because I think on today's World City Forum, what I love about our forum is that not only do we bring together sort of economic development geeks and economists like me, but we bring together architects and we bring together urbanists and community stakeholders and folks who care about placemaking. And what I love about the idea and the concept of innovation districts, and I know Bruce talked about this in his opening session, was innovation districts allow us as community builders and as placemakers to really come around and think about how we can take a cluster-based approach and really bring it into a sort of city district by district approach. And so I'm going to spend some time today talking about innovation districts broadly and helping us kind of uncover these concepts. For many of you today, these may be some old hat. You may have a really great experience on this, but for a lot of us that are joining today's session, this may be the first time that you've actually had an opportunity to talk about this. So I'm going to give a wide varying of definitions and descriptions, and then offer some case studies as well as we go through this. So, broadly speaking, as we think about innovation districts, I like to tell my students at the LBJ School, who are all smart, aspiring urban policy folks, to think about that the innovation district is a clustering approach at a district strategy that is extremely hyper-local and offers benefits. It can also offer externalities if we're not measuring for the managing for those externalities and the challenges of that. And generally speaking, when we think about a cluster development, kind of Mike Porter 101, a lot of times we're sort of just focusing on the idea of the economic assets, right? And how do you create those ecosystems that really leverage the economic assets? That could be, great firms. It could be the talent. It could be the anchor-based institutions. But one of the things that makes innovation districts really so interesting is that in addition to thinking about the economic assets, we're also going to spend time thinking about the physical aspects. Like, what does the space look like? What does the design of the district look like? Are we being very intentional about how we are thinking about the efforts of creating community by design? And my husband's an architect, and we always talk about the idea that his work is always about kind of creating the space, and the work that I love doing in the space is about bringing people together. And that's one of the things I love about innovation districts is that you get the economic assets and the physical asset, the design elements, and we're trying to really create those together. And then in addition, that's kind of third element to that is really around social capitalism. It's creating, what folks at the Bass Institute and the Brookings Center, when they sort of originally done some of the original seminal work around innovation districts, they kind of labeled it as networking. I would maybe even take it maybe a little bit even more old school in that, and is to say it's about creating the social capitalism in a community, creating the networking about how we create community and create connections, and really build our networks and our community to really support innovation. And so, effective innovation districts from a policy perspective and from a strategic standpoint, really address the assets of economic assets, physical assets, networking assets, and really create a strategy to do that in a way that achieves and creates this district, which can benefit, hopefully benefit many stakeholders in the community. When I think about innovation districts, they're kind of several typologies or examples of these, and I'm going to share with you some of these as we go through. But first and foremost, I think one of the most interesting example, or the most sort of typical example of an innovation district tends to happen around universities and medical centers. Anchor institutions is perhaps maybe a word that many of us in this space spend a lot of time together. And it's about taking companies and startups and technology firms and trying to create that district. And there's a lot of great examples of that. In Philadelphia. There's a great example of that in Pittsburgh. Here in Austin, Texas, where I am, the University of Texas is trying to leverage its massive investments in a brand new medical school and match that with an opportunity in a district around technology and startups. So one is around this idea of thinking through university and medical centers. Secondly, sort of those non-traditional anchors, and that can be large government facilities. It could be research labs. I think more interesting enough, we're now seeing corporate headquarters play an important role of this. You can imagine that much of the development that's happening in Arlington around the new Amazon H2Q district headquarters is going to have very much this focus around an innovation district. Critical mass of startups. I think about this being, the quintessential example of what Tom Menino did around the Boston Innovation District, or in Boston, as a way to really kind of position Boston as an alternative for innovation and technology-based startups as it relates to other places in the region outside of Cambridge, for instance. So this critical mass of startups and enterprises. The reuse of urban land. Again, many of these you see some overlapping of these, but going back and asking questions about what is underutilized urban assets that we have, industrial land, maybe it's waterfront land, and asking the questions about how can we catalyze investments that we're seeing that are maybe being made with new infrastructure and transit, and adding this question of technology and innovation over the top of that. Something that I think is super exciting, and we're seeing this happen in more and more places across the U.S., is this idea of the redevelopment of suburban office parks and science parks. I know that, for instance, in the state of New Jersey, there's a lot of conversation about the remaking of old suburban office areas, but also thinking about what is the remaking of the American Mall and how we could think about that as an opportunity for technology, partly because we see such a great opportunity with large pieces of land and lots of opportunity around the density and proximity of assets there. And then finally, coming out of the pandemic, and something that I think is, as we imagine that more and more central business districts are facing this challenge of the pressures that remote work has put on. Many of our commercial districts have not had as much investment as happened. Really about the remaking of our downtowns, creating these centers of innovation and entertainment, and the mixing and making around this typology. So the remaking of downtowns, and for me, like, this is, I think, one of the more exciting opportunities as it relates to the use of innovation districts in the urban fabric today, is asking the question about what does this look like. You can imagine taking this concept as we're looking at the opportunities that are presented with us in Midtown Manhattan, for instance, or in some of our downtowns that haven't seen the return back to commercial district, the idea of the innovation-based innovation approach, innovation district approach happening in those creates real opportunity for policymakers and developers and economic developers and urbanists to think about the reuse of that space. So as we think about that typology, I think the next thing that I'd like to do is offer some guiding principles and really speak to some case studies and some examples of what I think are some real outstanding innovation districts to look towards. And many of you may have heard of these. Hopefully, maybe these are some new examples and best practices that I could put on your radar as we go through this. There's a lot of great approaches and principles about how to think about innovation districts. And again, some of the quintessential work that happened at the very beginning through the Bassett Initiative and others have offered an array of interesting principles. But what I want to do is just kind of summarize these down into what I think are just maybe 5 core principles to think about. The first and foremost, I think, is that is the principle of what I like to say is the mixing and matching. I think of what really makes successful innovation districts really jump out to me is this idea of how we take different types of disciplines and different types of innovative sectors and really mix them together. And in fact, if you go back to the original work that my colleague Rich Florida wrote about in The Rise of the Creative Class, this is really his idea of the innovation and the creative economy coming together to create that sort of secret sauce that really drives innovation forward. So mixing and matching, the clustering of innovation sectors together, it is the idea that districts, that successful districts, I think, are powered by a diversity of institutions, a diversity of different types of companies, a diversity of different types of startups, all having different types of disciplines and different types of approach to innovation. And one of the most examples for me that I just really love and have followed from my days as a young graduate student a long time ago in Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon is the Pittsburgh Innovation District. And I love the Pittsburgh Innovation District because it speaks to the revitalization of one of my favorite cities in the country, one of my favorite neighborhoods in the country, and frankly, leverages the assets, I think, of 2 just fantastic research institutions that have been super important to the revitalization and the rebirth of Pittsburgh. And I think about, the mixing and mingling of these ideas where you've got the University of Pittsburgh, which is a world-class life science and health sciences center, ranked among some of the most amazing healthcare facilities in the country. And then you've got my alma mater, Carnegie Mellon, which is, it takes real pride in its technology and its computer science programs and its robotics programs. And what's really interesting, I think, about this district is that it does exactly all of those things that we talk about in terms of the mixing and matching. It pulls together, great startup firms, great anchor institutions, and really creates, opportunities for innovation that sees the idea of taking, the robotics and the computer science of CMU and mixing that with the healthcare and the life sciences expertise of Pitt, and you see just amazing outcomes. Startup rates that are sort of 10 times the U.S. average are some of the metrics that you see here. An amazing amount of venture capital dollars that have been attracted to really support innovation based in this piece. And one of the things that I would credit the leaders that are relating back to this Pittsburgh Innovation District is that there now has been not only this idea of how do you leverage the assets to create the innovation capacity, but also now going back and asking the really important questions about how do we create the opportunity and the spillover effects and the inclusivity of the Hill District, which is an underserved neighborhood that touches that district and ensuring that that district also includes the opportunities there. So I love the Pittsburgh Innovation District. It's a great example and a great case study. If you haven't had an opportunity to follow that, I think it's one to look to. The second the second piece that I want to really draw your attention to is the idea of the principle of proximity and networks. And I think this speaks to two principles, and that is first ensuring that we're kind of creating that space and that opportunity for people to come together, to create, to connect, collaborate, to learn together. And that's really where I think the physical design and the perspective comes into that space. But also being very intentional about programming and being very intentional about how we create that opportunity for people to connect together. And what I like to think about, and a lot of times a principle that we share even with my urban development clients is if you're thinking about that creation of capital and how you create it, keep it in your communities, it's that stickiness of like how you get people to create community together and to place that really drives that capital together. So thinking through how we build proximity, how we design proximity, and how we program that is super important. And to that end, another great example that I like is the Winston-Salem sort of innovation corridor, or the IQ. And this is an interesting space. And one of the things that I love from looking at some of the charter documents and strategies that that was put together is that very making an intentional point that innovation doesn't happen in isolation is a real principle of theirs. And there's been a real concerted effort around this innovation in the design of the space and the creation of this space to think about how you create the opportunity for people to come together. And so there's an attention to the idea of having, green space. There's nearly 2 acres of green space. There's a lot of amenities that have been programmed and thought of in terms of placemaking and the placement of those throughout the district as it relates to places where people can come together. And then finally, I love that there is lots of different entrepreneurial events and conversation opportunities. And there's been a lot of intentionality around not just creating that networking experience, but even taking a step forward to saying, how do we ensure that we're creating connections, but creating intentional connections? And so you see that through, having, an opportunity for office hours with attorneys. There's pitch practice sessions with VCs and mentors. There's the idea of thinking about how you create they've intentionally created the types of co-working spaces together. And so this for me is a really terrific example of about how a city has approached this and being about taking the built environment and matching that with the networking opportunity to create community. I also love this example, frankly, because it's not in a large city. And I think there's this question that innovation districts can only be in sort of your sort of large city over a city or region over 1 million. And this is not a large, Winston-Salem is not a large city. It's a mid-sized metropolitan area here in the U.S. And it has taken this approach and done a really great job of catalyzing innovation in its space. The third idea for me is this idea of putting innovation on display. And I love this idea. I love the idea of storytelling and communicating and being very public about the work that's happening in the space and doing it in a way where community members across the city, across the region can really experience the great type of capability and work that's happening in these innovation districts. I think it's important to realize that, urban development and economic development and placemaking is all about doing all the physical work, and it's all about making sure that you're leveraging all the economic assets, but it's also about storytelling. It's about celebrating storytelling and being being responsive to that, and doing it in a way where you represent stakeholders across a community. And the example for this one for me is the Medellin Innovation District. And as we may know, Medizim has a world class reputation from really going through an amazing transformation into one of the most challenged communities in Latin America to one of the most sort of livable communities today. And so what I love about this innovation district is there's lots of community public events and innovation bazaars and opportunities for community members to come together to experience this. And so they've done a really great job with this district, particularly of putting innovation on display, helping to have this innovation district tell the story for what Medizim's future looks like and what opportunity can be created in this innovation district and the city quite broadly. And there's a lot of great cultural amenities that are here. The mixing and matching of innovation and culture and creativity have done a really a great opportunity of creating not just an innovation center, but extending that beyond kind of the main street approach for folks in this. And so you see, central business districts, shopping opportunities, pedestrian life colliding with this idea of innovation as a terrific example. And again, I love this example because this is not one that's in North America. We can see the idea of innovation districts really taking off in all parts across the country. And this is a real terrific example of one that's happening in South America. The fourth point I think is that real innovation districts think about strategy and are thinking about strategy for today and for tomorrow. And so, I think as communities are wanting to uncover these districts and think about how you can approach this as a way to grow your innovation-based economy, I think that strategy has to be both big and small. You have to think large, but you have to think small. You have to think long-term, and you also have to think short-term. And in addition to that, it's about understanding those strategies and those policies and ensuring that we're connecting them with funding mechanisms and ensuring that we're thinking about how that strategy around this innovation district is really thinking about implementation. And so as we build out strategy for any of our community development work or any of the work that we do, it's important to understand that innovation and strategy and economic development strategy is only as good as the implementation plan that we put forth, and an implementation plan that's driven by partners. And so thinking through how, what is the strategy idea? How do we activate on it? How do we resource it? And who is our partners and who's on tap to ensure that those opportunities are happening? I think the Liverpool Innovation Precinct is a really fantastic example of this, where you see strategic effort happening across multiple sectors, a real public-private partnership with the public sector, healthcare institutions, and education folks really looking at this. And what I love about this strategy is being very intentional about how the use of public dollars, particularly around redevelopment dollars, have been matched with the idea of wanting to grow innovation-based economies and leaning into the idea that this will be a true sector and a very important sector to the growth of the community. In laying out, I think also when you look at this plan and this strategy, really clear milestones, really clear partnership understanding, and really clear sort of KPI metrics by which we can go back and evaluate our progress, but also have good communication points and talking points to really go back and communicate to the public about what are the signs of success and how we're measuring those successes going forward. The fifth point, and I'm going to talk more about this in a bit, is the idea that successful innovation districts really do a great job of embracing equity and do this from the onset. And I think more and more innovation district work and innovation policy work that's happening today is really doing this from the onset and not having to think about it and go back and retrofit for equity. So embracing equity from the beginning and understanding that as you go through this process of strategy development and plan implementation, that we're thinking about the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ensuring that it's baked into vision, our goals, and our strategies, and being very cognizant and very sort of bright-eyed and smart to understand that sometimes innovation-based approach can create externality challenges, and we have to get around those externality challenges. And so, for instance, understanding that a lot of times when we do this types of innovation district, that there's a possibility for affordability issues. There's a possibility for the challenges that of displacement that could come with gentrification, and understanding that we have to be smart about the policy approaches from the onset, and managing and measuring our approach about how we're addressing those issues at the initial start of our work is super important. So, long-term success demands that we're thinking inclusively about our collaboration and thinking about how we are engaging representatives from a larger, broader base of engagement. And I'm going to offer some insights, particularly on this topic in a bit, but embracing equity as we go through. Fantastic example of this, and I think perhaps that Bruce spoke some about this, is the Innovation District, the Cortex Innovation District in St. Louis. Relatively a newer innovation district, so to speak. But one of the things that I loved about going back and reviewing the plans and the work around this is, in 2017, a real commitment to come back and be, quote, the most racially, ethnically, and gender inclusive district in the country, a place that opens opportunities for women and people of color. And what I love about this is that you can see in the efforts, and you can see in the strategies, and you can see in the practices that they've done a really outstanding opportunity of sort of walking the talk, so to speak. And so you see a significant increase of entrepreneurs of color. You see a significant increase of women. You see great representation of different types of stakeholders representing St. Louis as part of the board membership that is sort of supporting this innovation district. And so, I think that this is a great example about the idea of that if you are wanting to think about an innovation district as a way to drive inclusion, this is a great example by which we can look to as an outstanding paradigm for doing that. So those are some examples and some principles by which we may think about innovation district. So let's imagine that your community, you're thinking through this, and what are some things by which we could assess impact? And through that, I want to present you with kind of a summary of 5 ways to think about how do we understand if we're achieving success. And there's a lot of kind of toolkits and assessment questions out there. And as I sort of went through them, these are kind of the 5 key questions that I kind of landed on as roles to kind of ask yourself, are we ensuring the right types of policy advancements? First and foremost, where are the community's assets, and how do you build around them? 2 is, how can we leverage the district to strengthen our capacity? 3 is really, how can our district continue to foster equity and inclusion? 4 is really asking the question about how do we accelerate and use this district to really to accelerate those connections, to create those serendipitous collisions, creative collisions that are super important. And then finally asking, what is the leadership, and do we have the leadership that's present? And if we don't have a over-representation, how do we get a larger representation of a leadership that really can allow us to assess and think about this for capacity? And I want to close today by just talking a little bit about this idea of inclusion and how we take a broader inclusive innovation framework and apply it to innovation-based districts. Again, there's no doubt that innovation-based economies and innovation-based economic development is super important to the future of our communities, and particularly to the future of the resiliency of our communities, as we've seen in the pandemic, and understanding how we create new opportunities for job creation and wealth creation. But I think as urbanists and as placemakers and as folks that care about community development, we have to understand that there can and there often is externalities that can be created by approaching an innovation-based, a creative approach, or a creative economy-based approach. And so I think as we think about the Innovation District as a policy tool, as a development tool, we have to really focus in on this idea of making a commitment to inclusion. And I want to offer just some ideas and some principles around that. I always start from the idea, and I think most urban developers that are helping to support this work across the world really start from the idea that an innovation district can and more importantly should advance a community's capacity for inclusivity, and particularly inclusive innovation. I think that is a foundational principle, and that for me is a starting place. And so the question for us is how do we do that, and what are some things to think about in order to achieve that? First and foremost, I think is really to committing to local, meaning that understanding as we build out the innovation district that you don't have to attract all the assets, that not all the assets have to come from outside the community, that a lot of the assets that you have around innovation districts and innovation-based economies should and come from your local community, should be reflective of who you are as a community. The innovation district in St. Louis should reflect the character of those businesses, enterprises, and residents, and be different from that of Pittsburgh or that of difference of here of Austin, where I am. So making a real commitment to this idea that the ingredients that we need for success are local, and we're going to invest in those local assets. That's one. Two, I think, is being very, very intentional about engagement and engaging the community to ask about what are the support structures that are needed to support an inclusive-based approach to this. And not think about engagement as just sort of checking the boxes, but really using it as a way to drive strategy and ensuring that we're getting, great participation. And there's a lot of folks in our space now that have amazing ideas about how to really activate and accelerate community engagement through design thinking, through more participatory activity, to the way that we can think about getting different types of folks around the table to participate in our community. But from the onset, being very clear that we're going to engage the community and engage a broader base of community to ensure that we're doing this. Thirdly, there's lots of places that the districts that have made commitments to being what they're calling themselves of living wage districts, and that is to say, not only for these innovation-based companies, but for all the support structures around us. The folks that provide our perhaps services in our coffee shops, in our co-working spaces, in the restaurants, and all the local services that support these districts, ensuring that in making commitment to promoting livable wage practices is a way to think about how we broaden the idea of innovation, not just to the folks who are the primary stakeholders and participants, but those that are also affected throughout and impacted by this district as well. Making a commitment to buy local. One of the greatest tool I think that innovation districts have, and particularly innovation districts that are tied to large key anchor institutions on major and scale employers, is your procurement, and making a commitment to thinking about how you buy local. So either buying local, making commitment to buying procurement or procuring services from underrepresented enterprises, but making a real commitment to local procurement is a great way to use the size and scale of a development, both from the onset but on to the continuation, to ensuring that we're thinking about using the size and scale of our purchasing as a way to create a catalyst for scaling underserved and opportunity for scalable enterprises in our communities. Making a commitment to breaking down barriers, understanding and really being clear about an action step as it relates to equity and well-being, and the commitment to that, and creating and using the powers and the capabilities of the innovation district to address equity challenge that your community faces. Mike Porter talks a lot about this idea of thinking about how you create shared value. What is the shared value between your innovation-based district and the community at large? It's kind of a fifth point. And then finally, I think, one of the quintessential issues that we face as folks that are community builders is that economic development and innovation-based development is all going to be centered around workforce development and pipeline development. And so engaging our firms, engaging different institutions, engaging different community support organizations, community action organizations, to really think about how we're building out an inclusive pipeline. And thinking about that pipeline, through K through 12, thinking about that pipeline as an opportunity for reskilling opportunity, asking real questions about, what are the barriers that keep folks from participating in some of these jobs? Are we over requiring too many credentials or requirements as it relates to job postings and talent pipelines? And so being very intentional about how we think about pipeline and the people that populate and support these innovation districts is important. And so thinking about our pipeline as well. So with that, I think we're at time, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about my perspective on innovation-based economies, why I think they're important to urban development today, and really how we can think about doing it in a way that builds a greater opportunity for all of the residents, and really deploying, I think, a policy opportunity and a mechanism in the innovation district that brings together the built environment, the economic asset, and placemakers to create more inclusive economies. So thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to the questions that you have. My contact information is here. Feel free to reach out, pedigo@utexas.edu. You can also find me on Twitter as well. And then a very special shout out to one of my really smart, fantastic LBJ graduate students who helped pull this presentation together. Jonathan Clan did some great work on looking through some of our case studies. So with that, I look forward to your questions, and thank you for the opportunity to present.
Great, thanks, Stephen. That was a fantastic amount of information to digest in just 45 minutes. Definitely going out with a bang here on top of the conversations we had with Bruce and then with Greg, Tim. So before we jump into some of the questions and comments, I just want to thank everyone that's joining us here today. I know some of you probably have to run to other meetings and virtual conversations. I just want to thank you for coming to our first virtual World City Summit. Make a note that our next one is going to be April 11th, where we'll be chatting about the livable city and be joined by Richard Florida and other experts to discuss how we enhance the livability of cities. And we're excited to announce that our World City Global Forum is going to be again in New York, October 2nd to 4th. You'll all receive an email later today as our first pre-sale tickets for that event will go on sale later this afternoon. As always, there'll be an unlimited number of virtual tickets, but there's only 300 seats. I'm at the Time Center if you want to join us in person. So with that housekeeping set aside, I want to kind of dive into, Stephen, some of the conversations or questions. I mean, I'll kind of recap some of the things I heard out of the sessions today, kind of 3 key points, and we can jump into a conversation about them. One was that the definition and the geography of the innovation economy is maybe changing and shifting, that we've thought about innovation as really being tied towards tech, but as Bruce talked about, a lot of other sectors. I mean, you talked about how 24 cities were really controlling, I think, what it was 3/4 of the access to venture capital. So I want to touch a little bit on that in terms of how the geography of the innovation economy is changing and what that means for cities. I think the second key point, and this was brought up by Emma Frost in the session with Greg, was that, place matters. I think maybe that's something that's been lost in all our conversations about return to office and the occupancy in our central business districts. There seems to be this sort of narrative that physical space doesn't matter. But what Emma talked about with a lot of these things, as we think about life sciences, we think about reshoring, advanced manufacturing, they all require physical space. Maybe we don't have the right kind of physical space. So what does that mean for our cities moving forward? I think the last piece, which you really elaborated on, was that, not just building a innovative economy, but an inclusive economy. So we have this kind of opportunity in the redistribution of economic activity, perhaps between cities, but also thinking about how we make that more inclusive within the city itself. So we just have a few minutes here. I want to kind of dive into some of the questions that came up here, and maybe kind of first starting with that one about the geography of the innovation economy. You showed some examples of, they weren't New York, it wasn't Silicon Valley. I mean, what do you think is the future hold for second-tier cities, not just in the US, but in other countries as it relates to thinking about innovation and innovation district development?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think so. So first and foremost, I think the person that's done the most amazing work on this is Mark Murrio at Brookings, particularly as it relates to the U.S. And so I would give some shout out to Mark and his team. Obviously, Steve Case wrote a book called the Rise of the Rest, but I think Mark's work from a policy standpoint is really quite interesting in this space. I think we see this happening. I think that remote work has created an opportunity for communities to really play in the innovation-based space and create these innovation-based economies. I think it has created a lifeline. I think the externality challenges that a lot of larger cities have faced, affordability challenges, those types of things that with remote work have created a moment in time, I think, for second and third tier, third tier, however you want, smaller communities to create these innovation-based ecosystems. I think the thing that I would submit, though, if I was let's imagine if I was a policymaker advising folks in those spaces, I think I would say great opportunity, but be very clear about the types of innovation economy that you want to create, right? And so be very clear about understanding how you're building an innovation economy to support some of the commercial assets and some of the quote unquote industry sectors that you already have. How do you infuse innovation and technology into those sectors? And I think Bruce talked a little bit about this in his thought, which is having a clear point of view about the type of innovation-based economy that you want to create. So if you're building an innovation-based economy in Tulsa, for instance, or Northwest Arkansas, or Memphis, or in Bernie, Texas, for instance, what is that? What is your point of view, and what types of specialization and what types of innovation ecosystems are you creating? I think is super important, because it allows you to be very targeted in your strategic approach, right? It allows you to be very targeted in the types of policies that you put in to support that. It allows you to be strategic in the types of, like, how do you support the expansion of particular types of firms and creating the technical services or attracting the types of capital that you have? Or more importantly, how do you broaden the pie for greater representation in those sectors? I think having a point of view and perspective on that, and not realizing that it always has to be truly sort of technology-based, startup software types of firms. It could be the idea of taking something you're really smart at and infusing technology into this. For instance, I think of Northwest Arkansas. And everyone knows the rise of Bentonville and much of that because of the great investment that the Fortune 50 companies have played there, but also the Walmart Family Foundation and others. But I look at that area as a technology innovation ecosystem that's growing, not in the idea that it's going to be a software town, but having a real point of view that it's going to be, for instance, the best technology-based town around supply chain logistics, because it requires, it's got the assets to that. It's got one of the best supply chain development programs at the University of Arkansas, for instance. It's got the major Fortune companies in Walmart and Tyson's and J.B. Hunt and others that have that capability and smartness around that. And so they're building an innovation-based ecosystem around that specification. And I think that, for me, if I was advising places all over the country, that would be the point of view. I think of Quad Cities, where we've done work, Chris, where you've got John Deere and the great opportunity around creating ag innovation in a space that can really own that space around a real anchor, having a point of view. So is to say, I think it is spreading. Yes, I think the work that Mark and others are doing in cataloging is yes. But if I was advising policy leaders, I'd be really focused to saying, know who you are and go all in on investing that in that capability and spreading that throughout different types of firms. That's just my perspective.
All right. Yeah, I think you used the word ecosystem here, and I'm going to try and knit a couple questions together here. One from Nico, who asked a little bit about innovation districts, kind of akin to 15-minute city, concentration of activity, everything being geospatially quite condensed. Alan also talking a little bit around how pre-COVID innovation districts looked a certain way, high density urban areas. Should we, and I talked about this a little bit with Bruce in our first conversation, more thinking about innovation as a regional network. Is district even the right word that we should be using, or do we need to be talking about innovative cities, innovation ecosystems, and thinking about this in a larger, more networked way rather than a concentrated single point focus?
Yes, and I think yes and no, right? I mean, I think I love the idea. I mean, I think that it is this idea of systems and regions is super important. Connectivity is important. I think here where I live in Central Texas and in the Austin area, there's a lot of conversation about this idea of how do you catalyze the quote unquote startup miracle that is Austin, Texas, and do it in a regional way that creates opportunity. And so I do think it is about this idea of regionalism. It is about this connection. I don't want to lose the word district because I think there's an important point to the idea of concentration of creating place. And I think when you think about when you think about regional and network, do you divorce the idea of place around it? I think what has made some of these innovation districts and some of the examples that we went through and that others have talked about so important is this idea of the creation of place and the creation of space together and opportunity for people to come together. And I think while we all lived in the pandemic world of remoteness, I think there's this craving of where people are spending more time together and wanting to create that space and having flexibility around it for sure. But for me, the word district still allows us to think about how we are creating the placemaking, the design of space. Because I think if you go back and understand the quintessential sort of fundamentals of this approach, it's about taking a broader regional approach, clustering approach, systems approach, and concentrating it in a district with a place-based approach, right? The idea of connection of place to network is what an innovation-based district is. And I don't think by abandoning the word district, we could call it innovation-placed approach. I think you just want to ensure that we ensure that the place or the physicality remains, because I think it's super important to creating all of that, serendipitous connections and opportunity and all those things that come with creating that stickiness, right? That becomes really important in community.
Oh, I think Emma Frost would agree with you. I mean, she described how innovation districts were part of the solution, but they weren't the whole solution.
Yeah, right. And one of the things that you may think communities may be thinking through is multiple sort of innovation-based districts, right? And multiple ways to take this idea of how you take an innovation-based approach. I mean, innovation-based approach is it's to be crude in a sense, is the idea of taking a very traditional sense of an arts and culture district, which many are an entertainment district, right? And programming it in a way to support economic development. I love what Buenos Aires has done, where they've taken this approach and applied it to different types of creative industries across their city, a way to grow their film or their design districts, et cetera. And so I think there is something to be said about, particularly in a time where for more than 2.5 years, we divorced ourselves from place. There is maybe a need, I think, to reinvest ourselves and kind of marry ourselves back to place. And so you can imagine where you do a collection of these districts or a collection of these investments across your city around multiple industries and multiple ideas, but going all in on the investment of creating community around place, I think is super important as it relates to, frankly, also addressing some of the challenges that we're going to face in terms of remaking our central business districts, our entertainment districts, and all those types of things. So I am very much, I think, with Emma and saying you got to put really hold on to the place piece of this.
Well, I think we could probably go on there's more questions. Unfortunately, can't get to them all, but needing to wrap up here. I think, one of the takeaways, maybe ending on that note, is, would you agree that, place maybe matters more than ever before? And that we've lost some of that narrative in the whole return to office, remote work conversation. What's your thought on that?
Absolutely. Any community city strategy going forward has to have placemaking tied to it. Absolutely, without a doubt. Destination development, placemaking is super important. The programming, the software of our cities, I mean, there's study after study that says it's important, and more so before where we have had a void of it for such a long time. It is really, really important that the places that I think get this right will be the places that really are the places that come out on top.
Sure. Couldn't agree more. So thanks so much for joining us, Stephen, and thank all of you for joining us today at our first World City Summit. We'll look forward to hopefully seeing you again virtually, albeit on April 11th at the Livable City Summit and in New York this fall. Thanks, everyone.